Welcome to Weird Web Radio, an explorer's guide to hidden worlds of the paranormal and occult, reality-expanding experiences, and the downright weird and bizarre. With your host, Lonnie Scott.
Welcome to Weird Web Radio. I'm your host, Lonnie Scott, and tonight with us we have a very special guest. His name is Matt Swayne. Matt is a journalist working as a research writer at Penn State. He's also had a background in freelance reporting. Matt's written 3 books in the world of the paranormal, which includes America's Haunted Universities, Haunted Rock and Roll, and his latest book that's out at booksellers everywhere, Ghosts of Country Music. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on. I'm really excited about this.
I'm really excited to talk to you too. And for my listeners out there, I heard Matt being interviewed on Coast to Coast AM recently, and if any of you are Coast to Coast insiders, you can go back, I think it was maybe a couple weeks ago, and catch that show. I highly recommend it. We're likely going to cover some of the same ground and different ground, and Matt's research and stories were so compelling, I tracked him down and harassed him until he agreed to be on my show.
That's pretty accurate.
So here we are, folks. I'm very, very excited to talk to you. You represent sort of a unique guest. I haven't talked to anyone like you just yet for my show in the early stages here. In case you're wondering, you're the 7th episode.
Okay. And
I've talked to some actual paranormal investigators. I've talked to a practicing witch out in the Northeast. Mm-hmm. I've talked to an expert on Icelandic magic. Wow. And no one's been quite the researcher that you are. And I'm really interested to see how this all came about. So to get kicked off, why did you choose to tell ghost stories?
Well, I have a really long story about that because it literally started at birth. I was born on Halloween, and when you have a Halloween birthday, you tend to learn either to embrace the weird or not. And I embrace kind of the weirdness of having a Halloween birthday. I remember as a kid, you would get those book forms every once a month or so, and you could order books out of it. And I was always ordering books on the Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot and ghosts and all of that. I tried to stretch out Halloween year round. So I think that's really started my interest in the supernatural, horror movies, monster movies, science fiction, all of those sort of things. But I didn't start writing about the paranormal until I was a newspaper reporter for a local newspaper, in Tyrone, Pennsylvania, which is where I'm from. And, every Halloween I would always try to have a good Halloween feature story. I felt like it was my birthright. So one year I decided to do local ghost lore, and there was several ghost stories from around my hometown. They are typical Appalachian stories of these ghosts that haunt certain hollows and mountainsides and forest roads. And I wrote a couple of those stories. And then as sort of trying to fill out the story a little bit, I found I decided I would look into Penn State Ghost Stories, which is a university very close to Tyrone. And I found so many ghost stories at Penn State that some type of light bulb went off in my brain, and I said, this is really interesting stuff. And then I should add that the reaction to the story, I would write 10 stories a week, and the reaction could be anything from people yelling at me on the phone to complete indifference. But for some reason, this story attracted so much attention. People would hound me on the street about it, about how much they liked it, and they would tell me their own ghost stories and, did you hear this one? And I thought, this is really compelling for me as a journalist and as a writer. So I'm an info pack rat. I began to collect stories about ghost stories of universities primarily. This was the age before the internet, so I would have to wait around every Halloween and check out college newspapers to see the latest ghost stories that they were writing about. And over the years, I collected those, and through another kind of synchronicity, I was connected with a publisher in Llewellyn, and I wrote my first book, America's Haunted Universities. And then I just, because I was a disc jockey for a few years, I decided I would look into the ghost stories of rock and roll. And I also had a sort of a model for me was Gary Patterson's books. He writes a lot about the fringe of rock and roll and some of the ghost stories, but a lot of the conspiracy stories there, the 27 Club, the Crossroads Curse, things like that. So that's kind of how I started writing about the paranormal. As you mentioned, I'm a little different from most of the folks out there, is that I'm not a ghost hunter. I've never gone on a ghost hunt that I was aware of. I sort of think the hours are terrible for these poor ghost hunters to be out, at 3 o'clock in the morning in somebody else's house. I do, however, have an open mind. I consider myself an open-minded skeptic, and I respect these people who are really trying to find what I encounter when I talk to a lot of these researchers and investigators is they've had a profound experience and they want to find out the reason. That seems to be the general consensus when I talk to them. So I respect them. I use them in my books. I think they add some credibility to it, and I think they usually have the best stories as well. So that's my approach, is more of a journalist who is collecting this stuff, trying to present it in a compelling way. I try not to be too academic nerdy about it, but just between you and me, I have a real academic nerdy side. And as much as I think these books are fun and compelling, I think they cover some serious ground. And I think they're worthy of being looked at and read and passed on, and that's kind of another mission that I have when I write these books. So that's kind of the story in the nutshell for me.
Yeah, wow. So born on Halloween, you get inspired to go chase down these stories at some point, and I like that it all kind of starts at a university. Every university has some kind of legends wrapped around it. I live near Eastern Illinois University, and it's got in Charleston, Illinois, it's got quite a bit of ghost stories attached to it. And with every passing generation, it seems that there's another one or another layer added to the myths that surround the place. Well,
and that is what I found fascinating about it.
Oh, I agree. It's like each teller adds a little bit of their own flair, and you never quite know if someone's truly experienced what they're telling you or not. Now, you said that you don't go out and actually investigate yourself. You've never actually taken on that role or that job, at least none that you're aware of. So,
no.
How is it that how do you conduct your research for your books?
Well, mainly what I do is there's a couple layers to it, but one of the reasons I get asked all the time to go on these ghost hunts now I think it's kind of like I think there are probably ghost hunters throughout the country now who's made it a mission to get me to go out with them. So
sure.
I become kind of this unacquirable object that they want to possess. But the first thing I am looking for a lot of times is published accounts, because number one, I can kind of cross-source those. I can see how many people have written about it, and So I will look at newspapers, books, online sources, and then from there, will try to find people who may have witnessed it that I can talk to. Mostly what I started to do in the last 2 is reach out to ghost hunters, because there seems to be this level of writing about the problem when I'm writing about these ghost stories is a lot of people don't want to be quoted. And so, when you try to find these first-hand accounts, it's really gets difficult. It's almost like you go into a rabbit hole with these. But the ghost hunters are much more willing to talk to me about their experiences and as well as their opinions, both skeptic and believing, and the whole spectrum in between. So that's kind of my process. My process is, first of all, I use a little bit of I classify different ghost stories as either ghost lore or an actual ghost encounter, an encounter with the unexplained. So ghost lore tends to be published, but there's no real first-hand accounts. So I actually use those in the books because I think they're very important, even if they're not quote-unquote true. And then I'm also looking throughout those articles and those stories to try to find someone I can connect with that has an actual encounter. Because what I'm finding over the past, I guess I've been doing this for about 7 years, is that ghost lore, and again, ghost lore is just folklore that revolves around spirits and ghosts. What I find is that ghost lore and actual ghost encounters can be connected. In other words, where there's areas or buildings, and I found this a lot in universities, where there's buildings that there's a lot of ghost lore attached, typically you'll run into a few people who actually had an encounter with something they couldn't explain and went public with it. Those people could be long gone by the time I get to the story, but still there's this interesting connection. And for me, when I do put on my academic nerdy hat, I find it fascinating that those two could be connected, because ghost lore can kind of create, some of the paranormal researchers that I talk to, they believe that if you're in kind of a space that has the likelihood of ghosts in it, then sometimes you might encounter something. Like it's almost like you create it. Now the skeptics say that if you're in this area, your level of awareness rises to the point where you're labeling natural phenomena as paranormal phenomena. So to me, that's kind of interesting, and it's something I like to explore in these stories. What I like is the ability to have a multiple layered story where you have ghost lore, ghost accounts, skeptical accounts, and I think it fills out the story. So that's kind of my process when I'm trying to A, locate good stories, and B, write them, and some of the mechanism behind the stories. And generally what I do is I am really a compiler of stories, and I try to, in the case of haunted rock and roll, what I tried to do is create sort of like this paranormal history of the different ghosts from the different eras of rock and roll. And then I try to put in the ghost lore, the ghost accounts, and anything else I can really find to fill it out.
Well, it sounds like you've got a pretty tried and true method. I like that you respect the various aspects of a story in any case, whether it's a ghost encounter or it's actually written folklore. And even having that curiosity towards the skeptic's attitude, I think, is a healthy way to approach all these stories. All too often, I think too many people approach the paranormal and ghost stories, haunted locations, with this either-or mindset. They think it's either haunted or it's not. It's either your mind playing tricks on you, or it's a natural phenomenon, or it's a ghost. And right. I think the answer to a lot of these places lies in a mindset that says it's a natural phenomenon, and it's my mind, and it's possibly a ghost.
I am leaning more and more to that because it's just and quite frankly, when you're trying to write a story, and I've read stuff from absolute believers, and to me it gets a little boring. Everything is a ghost, everything is a demon, and likewise when you read a skeptic, some of the skeptic point of view is really kind of boring and in a way unfair. And I'll just, the skeptics have an atomic bomb on their side, and that is that if someone sees something, well, they're hallucinating. Well, 6 people see it. Well, it's a mass hallucination. You can't really get around that. So those things become pretty boring to me. So a lot of times I'm just trying to interest myself, and then I hope the reader picks that up too. And you definitely did, because I think that's the key. This if you really get into it, and again, I just try to write good stories that will interest people. But I do a lot of thinking about this as well. Long after the books are gone, I'm kind of left thinking about just how multi-layered this is. And I'll give you an example with ghost lore. I tend to think of ghost lore as folklore myth that never happened. But I think there's a case to be made that, especially when I interview people about their ghost stories, and they tell me their ghost stories, but they never fully commit that it was them. And a lot of times they'll say, well, people have seen this ghost in this area, and I've talked to a friend of theirs, and they were the ones that saw it, and they immediately shift it to the third person, which then becomes more ghost lore. And that's how I identify ghost lore, is when it's this other person who saw it. It's my uncle's brother's cousin's roommate saw the ghost on Penn State, that type of thing. So all of these things are really connected and kind of difficult to tease out, and I love that.
Oh, that's pretty cool. It shows that the stories kind of take on a life of their own, and across even friendships, let alone generations. In some ways, you are a modern version of the Grimm brothers, who traveled all over their own country collecting the folklore of their people, trying to puzzle out the mythology still present in their time.
This is modern mythology. Rock stars, we always call them like rock gods, and some of the terminology we use when we talk about an icon of country music, it's real. I mean, in my opinion, these people have reached a level that probably back in ancient times, the strongest Greek guy was named Hercules, and then all these stories started about him. I mean, I can kind of see that that's the level we have reached, especially in pop culture.
Yeah, you could be onto something. There's a lot of theory out there that says that, again, I think myth, ancient and modern both have that in common, that we approach it with that either or attitude, when I think it's better suited as an and.
Completely agree.
Now, when you got started researching these stories, what was it you found most interesting about the paranormal and ghost stories as you started digging into it?
I guess the one thing that I found most interesting when I started, especially doing haunted rock and roll, and just to give you a little background, I love rock music. I'm kind of an amateur musician, and I was a DJ for a while, and I pitched the project without really knowing whether any ghost stories were really out there. So I was up against it, but I was really relieved and intrigued by the volume of ghost stories that I found. and I found ghost stories, and I found ghost lore, and I found rock stars who have had encounters with ghosts. And, through Gary Patterson stuff, I was already kind of aware of this occult, echo that sort of followed rock and roll as it developed. And I became very intrigued as far as why rock and roll has this occult aspect and this I guess you would call it a fascination with the supernatural, both fans and the musicians themselves. So when I finished that book and kind of walked away from it, my idea was that rock and roll is just a special type of music that attracts people to the supernatural. And I credited a lot of that to the makeup of rock music itself, which is a cultural melting pot of you have African American blues, and you have African American gospel, and a little jazz, and then you have white European folk music and country music, and you of course have the blues thrown in there too. So those cultures seem to also bring their spiritual ideas too. So you have very traditional ghost stories. You have Celtic ghost stories from some guys like Led Zeppelin and Jimmy Page. You have African American mythology with the Crossroads and Robert Johnson. So you have this really super kind of potent pot of spirituality there. And you add on to that rock and roll is this outsider art that, most of the rock musicians come from the outside geographically, socioeconomically, and they come in and they create this. And so I think people that are into rock and roll tend to have a more accepting attitude towards the supernatural. So that was kind of my philosophy about haunted rock and roll as I was walking away from it, and I started to research the ghosts of country music. And what I found in the ghosts of country music is that quantity-wise, there is just as many ghost stories in the country music genre as haunted rock and roll. And by the way, I haven't backed away from my ideas about rock and roll so much, but what this did was it added another layer, and that added layer of complexity of, okay, now why is country music so haunted, if you want to say it that way? And I now have this belief that music is a spiritual technology. And when you think about the great religions and even the minor religions out there, they always, and I guess I shouldn't always say always, but they generally incorporate music into their worship service. So from classical times, you have classic organ, you have gospel songs, chanting, drumming. All of those are part of the worship service. So you have that aspect of it, that there is something about music. And even if you think about when you listen to a song, you're taken back in time, which is a kind of a supernatural thing. People say, wow, that song lifts my spirits. It raises consciousness. All of those. So I really, and quite frankly, I have yet to start working on ghosts of university research story writers or, ghosts of accountants. But there are a lot when it comes to artists, and especially musicians. So there's something very powerful about music that both the musicians get, and I think the fans of music get. And that's what I've discovered writing these books that I didn't expect to find.
And music does have that. It's this. I think you're right. It is a spiritual technology. It's connected to us as humans as far back as we can dig and discover, there's always been a rattle or a drum or who knows what. I mean, banging two rocks together may have created some rhythm that took people into a different state of mind. And that is kind of the magic of music is, you know, it doesn't just take you back. It can take you to an entirely changed emotional state. It can create expectations. It can make you cry. It can make you laugh. So I'm not surprised at all that you found as many stories as you did in music. And although I confess I was a little surprised by how richly and deep these more occult type tales were tied into country music for sort of the same reasons you found them in rock and roll.
Yeah.
Now, what were some of your favorite ghost stories you found in rock and roll?
Some of my favorite ghost stories in rock and roll, I have to say that, and probably because I wasn't as familiar with those stories as some of the other ones, but when I started researching Led Zeppelin, I stumbled, you can't stumble because it's very central to the Led Zeppelin mythos, is the idea, Jimmy Page was fascinated by Aleister Crowley and actually bought his mansion, which is, basically right on the shores of Loch Ness. Yeah, it's extremely a dark, kind of creepy mansion. There was ghost lore attached to it before Jimmy Page bought it. Apparently, there was a church on the property that burned down, trapping dozens of parishioners in the church as it burned, so they died. There was a story of someone being decapitated in the name of the mansion is called Bulliskin House, and someone was decapitated in it. All of these legends, and I always talk about how great it must be to be a real estate agent and have a haunted house in your territory, and then seeing Jimmy Page coming up to it because you got a sale. Where everyone else is probably avoiding it, he jumps right in. So some of the stories there, though, after Jimmy Page moved in and started talking about it, were really fascinating for me because, again, as this open-minded skeptic, as a journalist, I'm kind of looking for multiple witnesses. I'm looking for several different parties basically saying the same thing happened. And actually in Bulliskin House, and Jimmy Page kind of went public with a interview to Rolling Stone where he talks a little bit about some of the strangeness that went on. There were paintings during a party that levitated off the wall and drifted down to the ground, and several people saw that. A lot of people say, well, it was a party, everyone was drunk. But then there are other stories about Jimmy Page's friend who stayed overnight, who was sober and didn't take drugs. He was sleeping one night and he heard this thumping down the hall, and he figured it was the cats. So the next morning he asked the caretaker, please leave the cats out because I heard this thumping rolling down the hall, and it woke me up. And the caretaker said, well, the cats were in the room locked up, so that wasn't them, but it was probably this ghost. And then he told him the ghost story about this person who was decapitated, and then on certain nights you can hear that head roll down the hall. So the interesting thing for me was in reading the interview, the reporter says to Jimmy Page, have you ever heard this, thumping down the hall, this decapitated head? And he said, I never did. And then the reporter said, well, so you don't believe that your house is haunted? And he said, I didn't say that. I just said I didn't hear the head. So I thought that was kind of a cool story.
Yeah, that is a cool story. I've heard that Zeppelin, and especially Page, I think was the force behind it, wanted to rent that house on Loch Ness because of the associations with Crowley. And Crowley was rumored to have worked incompletely one of the longest acts of ceremonial magic in that place, which is his reason for being there.
That's yeah, and there's other stories there too about he accidentally wrote a curse down on his butcher order. Did you ever hear that story?
No, please tell.
Well, he was working that spell, and one of the reasons he picked Bullskin House was he said it was so preternaturally dark. It was dark on the brightest day of summer, and that's why he picked the story. Or I'm sorry, picked that house. And one time he was working on that spell, and he was interrupted, and it turned out it was the butcher who came for the meat order. So he ripped a piece of paper off, which contained part of the spell, and wrote his order down, gave it to the butcher, and when the butcher was filling out the order, he cut off his finger or was horribly maimed in some way. So that's the price you pay to be Crowley's butcher, I guess.
Somewhere out there, this podcast keeps discovering good band names. I hope that an up-and-coming rock band names themselves Crowley's Butcher.
Yeah, that's a great one.
Yeah, Led Zeppelin had a lot of kind of stories wrapped around them. I remember growing up, there's a local radio station we always kind of nicknamed the Zeppelin station because it seemed like every other fourth song was going to be a throwback classic rock Zeppelin time. And
I was probably the DJ on there.
Yeah, and I remember hearing my dad and others of his generation talking about how Led Zeppelin was rumored to have sold their soul for their music and made deals with the devil, and all sorts of stories swirled around that band.
Yeah, and there's the Zeppelin curse, which followed a lot of the members of Zeppelin, but not really Jimmy Page. One of the stories is Robert Plant was on vacation in Greece, and I think he and his family, along with Jimmy Page's daughter, were in a car wreck, and everyone was hurt except Jimmy Page's daughter. So there are a lot of stories that go around there, and quite frankly, Jimmy Page was not afraid to talk about it. He was very serious. The kind of the knee-jerk reaction on Led Zepp is, oh, they're Satanists, but if you really read into what Jimmy Page was talking about, is he believed in ceremonial magic, and it has a long, deep tradition in the UK. So it wasn't that strange for him, and probably had very little to do with Satan than we think.
Oh,
I don't know him personally, so
yeah, certainly. There's a lot of misconception about that, I think, and Crowley didn't help his image any when he went around the world trying to do what he was doing. But in many respects, he was ahead of his time. We may not even bat an eye to most of the things that were considered awful about him, today. Jimmy Page isn't the only rock artist out there who's been associated with Crowley. The modern band Tool, the drummer Danny Carey is an open and well-known practitioner of Thelema, which was what Crowley created. So outside of those two, I'm not sure I could tell you any others that were associated with Crowley specifically.
Well, remember he was on Sgt. Pepper's, the cover of Sgt. Pepper. There was another band that, and I write about it in the book, but now I can't remember their name. But they wrote a song called "Do What You Will," which was based on Crowley's kind of admonition that do what thou wilt is the whole of the law. I think it is. But anyways, they put out an album cover, and I believe they put Mickey Mouse ears on Crowley, and they became inadvertently part of the Led Zeppelin curse because their career went down the toilet right after that. And there's even this rumor that Jimmy Page had told them that he was not very happy with that image. So they ended up somehow in that Crowley Led Zeppelin curse era.
Now, what is the story behind the Led Zeppelin curse? I don't think I've actually heard about this before.
Well, it's just the fact that so many people have that are associated with the band ran into trouble, like John Bonham died. But even before that, they had accidents where he would get injured. And Robert Plant had some difficulties, and I think he may have lost his son. I'm trying to think if that's... I believe that's so, too. So there was a string of tragedies and accidents and deaths that followed that band. The skeptic side of me says when you have, first of all, bad stuff happens in everybody's life. But second of all, you have people who are very hard-living type people, and they're going to increase the odds of accidents and drug overdoses happening. So that's kind of the Led Zepp curse.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
And I think Gary Patterson probably covers it way better than I do.
Yeah, but I think you sum it up nicely when you say that when people are living hard lives like that, and not necessarily physically demanding beyond what they're doing to themselves, the risk for accidents definitely increases.
Yeah.
Now, outside of Led Zeppelin, another, I think, prominent figure from that era that is associated with the paranormal in various ways was Jim Morrison. What could you tell us about him?
Well, and I was going to say that the Jim Morrison ghost stories are some of the other ones that I found fascinating. First of all, Jim Morrison was really kind of conceived of himself as a living ghost, because the classic story is that when he was very young, he was a Navy brat. He was traveling with his parents across the country through the American Southwest, and they happened upon an accident involving several Native Americans, an automobile accident. And Jim Morrison later on said that he, as he was going past there, he felt the spirits of these Native Americans enter his body, and that influenced his poetry, even the way he moved on stage. And a lot of times when you look at a Doors concert, it does have this, shamanistic rite about it. So I knew that I was going to find some good ghost stories, but I had no idea. I found a ghost story from his childhood home in Arlington, when he lived there with his dad, who was probably wasn't an admiral at that time, but was going to be an admiral, near D.C. And the story there was that a woman who owned the house long after Jim Morrison was there said that one night she woke up and she saw, and she recognized him immediately. Jim Morrison was in the house, and there was this kind of etheric glow about him, and it frightened her to the point where she closed her eyes and covered her head, and she felt something coming under the covers in bed with her, and she turned to face, and it was Jim Morrison's ghost right in front of her. And this lady, kind of went public with it. She was on, the story was on television from that area. And so I found that intriguing. And by far the weirdest story that I have in Haunted Rock and Roll, which is filled of weird stories, is that Jim Morrison haunts a bathroom of a Mexican restaurant in Santa Monica. That was by far my favorite. And this story is that the owner was experiencing, some of the patrons were experiencing problems in the bathroom. I choose my words very cautiously as I say that. But they said that when they were in the bathroom, they could hear breathing, like someone was in there breathing next to them, was the kind of the vibe I got from the description. And often the door was rattling, like someone was trying to get in, violently rapping. And then there were some other, paranormal events going on. And so this owner, the people were kind of afraid, and the owner actually brought a medium in to try to get rid of the spirit. And what they found was that area, the bathroom, was the vocal booth for the Doors when they would record in California. And I think that was sort of part of their headquarters. So Jim Morrison is all through the book, and that one was probably my favorite weird one to write. I remember getting so excited when I saw the headline, Jim Morrison haunts a bathroom. I couldn't. I had to write that story.
Yeah, I want to say that's a surprise, but if you know much about the Doors and Jim Morrison, it's not a stretch to believe he's haunting a bathroom somewhere.
Right.
And now
that does seem to be his MO.
Yeah, there's belief out there that Jim Morrison may have been murdered, and then there's another belief out there that he never even died. There's a lot of conspiracy that swirls around him.
There's conspiracy, and it only makes my job much tougher. Not so much when I wrote about Jim Morrison, but you're right. There are a lot of certainly conspiracies out there that he was murdered. There's a conspiracy that Kurt Cobain was murdered. And then there's the rumor that Jim Morrison just kind of got sick of being a star and dropped out. And then there's this, story about Elvis Presley, who just was tired of being a rock star and quits as well. But to give you an example of kind of the layers that you go through, and it makes writing this very interesting, but in a way sort of difficult because you have to explain the layers at time to be fair and honest to the reader. But if you think about Elvis, and there's this classic story, ghost story of right after Elvis died, they were allowing fans to take tours of Graceland, but they weren't very formal tours. And there was a picture that circulated probably late 70s, early 80s of somebody in it would be the swim house, the house right next to the swimming pool. There seems to be Elvis Presley sitting in the door, and there's the camp that said this is a picture of the ghost of Elvis Presley, and then there's a camp that says this is just one of those members of the Memphis Mafia, a friend of Elvis, who is hanging out at the pool house. And then there, as another layer to this that says, dozens of people were dressing up like Elvis and became, Elvis reenactors and Elvis imitators. And then there's, this other layer that says, well, it's just Elvis. He's still alive. So you have all of those stories kind of blending in, and I'm not even really including a lot of the ghost lore that surrounds Elvis. That there's literally dozens of stories of Elvis, a truck driver driving on the highway picks up this young guy, and the guy said he wants to go to Memphis, and he gives him the address, and it turns out that he drops him off at the gates of Graceland, and as he looks in the light, he sees that it's a young Elvis Presley going back home. There's all those stories out there. So trying to tease out in rock lore especially, what's a ghost story, what's a conspiracy story, what's mistaken identity, all of those things kind of come into play.
Yeah, you've got your job cut out for you digging through all that, especially if you want to focus on a specific aspect of the artists and the music industry, where it goes paranormal and more ghost folklore versus the conspiracy theories. I definitely commend you on a job well done navigating those terrible waters. So you brought we talked about Jim Morrison, and you mentioned Kurt Cobain briefly, and correct me if I'm wrong, but those are both considered members of what's known as the 27 Club, yes?
Yes, they are.
Yeah. Now, can you tell us more about what the 27 Club is?
Yeah, the 27 Club is this propensity for rock musicians to die at the age of 27. And it actually goes, and Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse, Pigpen, Brian Jones, and it goes the whole way back to who I really consider the godfather of, the grandfather of rock and roll and the grandfather of haunted rock and roll, who's Robert Johnson. And Robert Johnson was a great blues musician who, there's such an interesting story about him and such great folklore. But in the nutshell, there was a rumor that he sold his soul to the devil and that to become a better guitar player. And that at age 27, the devil came to collect on that contract. And he died a very painful, horrible death, by all accounts, historical and folkloric. And since then, there's been this, definite trend of rock stars who die at the age of 27. There was an Australian study done, I don't know, I think maybe 10 or 15 years ago. And what they did is they looked at whether there actually was a 27 club and whether the number 27 as an age was statistically significant. And what they found was that it was not, that rock stars could die at pretty much any other age. So, being kind of a research writing wonk, I decided to look into the numbers, or at least the parameters they used. And as I remember, they were using number one artists on UK charts from 1950 to whenever. So right away, I kind of saw some problems with that. One thing is the rock era really doesn't get started until the late 1950s, 1957 or so. And even then, you don't really have rock stars. You just have a few really dominating the charts at that point. The other thing is, on the UK charts, you're automatically, I think you're going to roll out people like Janis Joplin and the Doors, because I don't think they hit a number one. They might have been in the top 10, but they didn't hit a number one. So I don't know, but here anecdotally is the reason why I find it still tenable as at least a really weird anomaly is when I did the Ghosts of Country Music, I started to look at the ages of the folks of the country musicians who died. And what you find is there is a much bigger swath of ages. You have Hank Williams, who died relatively young at 29. You have Patsy Cline at 30. And then you have Johnny Cash, who I don't even remember how old he was, but was a sort of an older person. Automatically, you'll probably say, well, the hard living aspect of it, especially for rock stars, is probably the reason. But, Johnny Cash was not exactly a spit and polish, clean guy all his life either. He had his run-ins with drugs and alcohol as well. So to me, it's still an open question. I still think that there is just this weird number 27 that is kind of a curse for these rock stars. And, even up till Amy Winehouse, which was relatively recent.
Well, maybe it's just due to the shock of someone being so young when they pass, and not just being so young, but they're so memorable. Their contribution and the body of work they leave behind is sometimes greater, in fact, than those who went on and lived longer lives and kept recording music. I think that's something kind of unique to the individuals in that 27 club.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Now, you brought up your country musicians, and of course your new book is The Ghosts of Country Music. I myself am not a fan of country music, so
okay. That's okay.
I do recognize names. My father listened to a lot of the older country music when I was a kid, and I know who they are, and I'm familiar with some of them. Now, you begin your book talking about Hank Williams. And
Yes.
so what is it about old Hank that makes him worthy of the rolling out the red carpet to a ghost story of country music?
Right. And I've always been a fan of classic country, which is Hank Williams, Patsy Cline, Johnny Cash. So that's kind of how I got into this. And also when I was writing the book, I would find references to, a ghost story involving the rhyme and whatnot. But the reason Hank Williams, he really is, he's sort of the king of haunted country, because there are so many ghost stories out there and ghost legends and ghost lore about Hank Williams. It is almost like every place that he performed, he still haunts. And what I find interesting about Hank Williams is that, throughout life, he was a brilliant musician, a brilliant songwriter, probably one of the best songwriters we had. And also he had that tortured artist vibe about him. He was a wandering soul. He had this persona called Luke the Drifter, and I think he recorded a few albums, which would be almost like an equivalent of Sgt. Pepper's type album. And so what I found interesting about him is these ghost stories seem to still have that wandering aspect of him. In other words, you can find his ghost. There are ghost stories where he's buried in Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama, at the cemetery there. Several musicians and artists, country artists, have recorded songs about his ghost haunting that area, that cemetery. But then there is this amazing story, and I guess amazing isn't the right word, because it really is tragic, but there's almost this comedic aspect of it that sort of towards late in life, Hank was falling deeper and deeper into drug and alcohol abuse. And just a kind of a side note here, I find what I like about writing these books is I write books because I don't know enough about people, so this helps me learn. And I learned a lot about Hank, which I just thought he was kind of a hellraiser, a honky-tonker. But apparently he had a form of spinal bifida and was in a great deal of back pain most of his life, and became addicted to drugs and alcohol probably because of that pain. But in any event, I guess Hank's manager had lined up a gig in Ohio and was a little afraid of Hank not being able to make it. So he hired a driver. I think in the book I said it started in Birmingham, but that might not be exactly accurate. He may have been in Alabama well before this. But in any event, the kind of Hank Williams death ride starts in Nashville, and he drives to Knoxville, and then he decides to take a plane, and then there are stories where the weather cancels it. There's a story that he was too much of a hellraiser, so he went back to Knoxville. He got drunk there, and then the manager asked them to leave right away to make this gig. They left, and in West Virginia, they discovered that Hank Williams is dead in the back of this Cadillac, which is somewhat poetic, I guess, for Hank. But what I found was all up and down that path, that death ride, you would find ghost stories that concerned Hank. First of all, he's all through Nashville. He's in the Ryman. He's in Opryland. You find that hotel that he stayed in Knoxville, there's at least one story that indicates that somebody had seen a ghost of this tall, lanky fella walking up and down the halls of the hotel. It's not a hotel anymore, but that's the story there. And then there are even ghost stories of where he finally died, which was this gas station in West Virginia. So that's kind of the reason why I started off with him. He really gets the crown for having the most ghost stories.
And that was something that I didn't know about Hank Williams. Maybe it's just because I didn't grow up a country music fan, but I was really surprised in your book how many stories are surrounding that man's name and legend.
Well, then,
go ahead.
And then I found one of my friends who is a medium told me this story because she has connections to the country music industry, and she spent some time in Nashville helping some of the events there, and she got to know some of the artists. And I think she had a newspaper column, and apparently someone sent her a letter, and there was to me, when she told me the story, I thought, oh, this is like an urban legend. But she showed me the column and the letter that was in the column from this, and the story is that this girl, she was sort of the chauffeur that evening for a dance. She was taking her high school friends to a dance, and on the way back from the dance, she was dropping people off, and she got lost. And as she got more and more lost, and farther and farther into the country, and was getting more and more panicky and scared. And finally, she stops at a gas station, and she basically has a breakdown. She starts to cry, and this gentleman came down the steps, and she described him as tall, thin, lanky, brown suit, big cowboy hat, southern draw, asks her what the problem is, gives her some money, gives her directions, and off she goes. And then a few days later, her mother is going through a country music magazine, and her mother was a big country music fan, but the daughter was not. The daughter sits next to her mom, and as she's flipping through pages, she said, well, that's the guy that helped me the other night. And the mother said, well, that can't be, because that's Hank Williams. And the daughter said that was absolutely the person that helped her out of that jam that night. So there's this kind of cool thing about Hank is you have the classic ghost lore, and then you get this mix of ghost lore slash ghost encounter that those are the ones that I really like.
It sounds like he's almost become a wandering mercurial figure that's both helpful and sort of a bridge to those spooky moments.
Right. And the funny thing is they described him as a guardian angel, and I thought, boy, old Hank has been called a lot of things, but not a guardian angel. So who knows? Maybe his soul has been reclaimed.
Yeah. Who knows what awaits us when we take our last breath? That's for sure. One thing is certain is transformation.
Yes.
Something else that surprised me looking through your book on country music was Johnny Cash. Johnny Cash is an artist, I think, who crossed over from country and explored other venues of music, especially later in his life. But I had no idea that Johnny Cash had such a legacy in the world of the paranormal, even while alive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I make the contention now that Johnny Cash was an early pioneer of ghost hunting. And I got that because, well, first of all, I always knew that he was a deeply spiritual man, and I knew about his gospel singing, and I also knew that he wrote a lot about Christianity and the profound effect that Christianity had on his own life. But what I wasn't aware of is that he had a deep fascination in the supernatural and spiritualism. And in the book, I talk a little bit about how he was connected to a medium who became one of the more fascinating stories in the book. His name was J. Bernard Ricks, who was a medium and essentially a guru to Johnny Cash and some other country artists. But the paranormal the paranormal researcher aspect of it comes along when he buys a house in Jamaica, a summer house called, or a vacation home called Cinnamon Hill, which was rumored to be haunted. And he talks about having a dinner party there, some guests that he invited down, some friends, and seeing a woman, and this is like 6 people in the same room. They see this woman enter the one side of the room through closed doors, walk by them, and disappear outside into another closed door, into another room. And then they hear this rapping after the whatever it was disappears. And so, you do have Johnny Cash, who you can say a lot of things about, but he was a very honest guy. And this was, I believe this was either from his autobiography or from one of his biographies that he talked about this incident. But the kind of cool thing for me was that Waylon Jennings stayed overnight one night and said that he heard this ghost rapping on his window. So Johnny went out and debunked it by saying it was a tree limb. It had natural phenomena. So he was kind of an early ghost hunter. And what I like about that story is it lends a little credence to some of his other encounters, because he did take the time to really try to find whether it was natural phenomena. And it really makes all his other stories pretty believable.
Well, I agree. When I started looking into the stories that when you're in your book, when you're talking about Johnny Cash, I thought, here's a man who has been so well known for both his deep spirituality and his music, his courageousness to go places where many country musicians simply wouldn't. And here he was out there basically creating methods of ghost hunting. Now,
Pioneer.
Are there? You said he was associated with a medium during his life. Has there been any attempt to contact him since his death through that medium or others?
Well, the thing about this J. Bernard Ricks is he just disappears. And the story, basically, from what I gathered from the pieces I pulled together, that J. Bernard Ricks was a postman in Shreveport. And he was also a medium who somehow hooked up with Johnny Cash, Johnny Horton, and Merle Kilgore, who's a songwriter. And Johnny Horton was famous for North to Alaska. He used to write these saga songs that became famous. And all three of those fellows were close friends. But somehow this J. Bernard Ricks enters the mix, and they spend a lot of time with him. And Merle Kilgore credits J. Bernard Ricks of saving his child. He said that his wife just put the baby into her crib, and J. Bernard Ricks calls and says, "Please check your baby." And the wife said, "I just laid her down." Went to check on her, and sure enough, she was turning blue. She had, I think the story was she got caught in between the railings and was choking. So there are stories like this, but the fascinating one for me was that, and Johnny Horton is also, I wrote about him in Haunted Rock and Roll, because there are some really strange stories surrounding him as well. But Johnny Horton dies in this tragic car crash in Texas, and before the funeral, Johnny Cash is talking to Merle Kilgore alone, and is talking about where Johnny Horton is now, and he makes the statement, "Well, Johnny, it's dark here and it's rainy here, but it's clear as day where Johnny is. It's bright as day where Johnny is." And they went to the funeral, and as they were sitting there, they noticed J. Bernard Ricks was jotting in his notebook, And he wasn't trying to be disrespectful, but this is how he would get messages from the spirit world. And so after the funeral, Johnny Cash tracks down J. Bernard Ricks and pretty much demands to see the notebook. And sure enough, they open up the notebook, and there's the phrase, "bright as this day," and some symbols that represent Johnny Horton. And so Johnny Cash, from that day forward, felt that Mr. Ricks had contacted Johnny Horton's spirit and got that message. And it probably made Johnny Cash feel good, because there's the other story that right before he died, Johnny Horton called Johnny Cash collect, and Johnny did not accept the charges. So maybe he felt a little relieved with that.
Yeah, when somebody calls collect and you don't accept the charges, I think that sends a message.
Yeah. That would have been funny if Johnny Horton would have said, "I'm sorry, I'm not going to get through because Johnny won't accept the charges."
Right. That would have been funny. Now, you've also written about curses and mysteries that remain in music. If you had to kind of choose one that is your favorite and really stands out of either, what would it be?
My favorite story, hands down, is the Crossroads Curse. And there's a lot of different levels to the Crossroads Curse. But, the story is that Robert Johnson was a blues guitar player. And he really wanted to be a good guitar player, but he was terrible, and he was also, according to some of the reports, pretty annoying. And he would hang out with these great blues guitar players who, they would try to teach him. They were trying to be nice to him, but apparently the patience wore a little thin, and they became mean and pushed him out of this blues circle. And he disappears for a year. And then when he comes back a year later, he is an amazing... And one of the blues players at that time, Son House, says that he was in they were playing at some juke joint, some, roadhouse out in the sticks, and they played a set, and then after the set, they went out into the parking lot to cool down because it was so hot. And as they were out in the parking lot, they heard this great blues guitar player. So they rushed in, and there was Robert Johnson, the guy that could barely play, up there, not just playing classic great blues, but he had pretty much his own style at this point. And so there was this legend of, if you want fame and fortune, you go to the Crossroads at midnight, and a man in black will show up, and he'll offer you a contract. You sign the contract. He retunes your guitar, and you're going to be a master guitar player. So pretty soon they started labeling Robert Johnson as someone who went to the Crossroads and sold his soul. And Robert Johnson makes, he actually writes songs about meeting the devil and Hellhound on My Trail and all these other things. And so at 27, he dies in this terrible death, and it reinforced this legend of the Crossroads. And then throughout rock and roll history, you hear this continually used when you talk about some of the greats. Bob Dylan at one point said that he sold his soul to the devil at the Crossroads. So there's this continual legend of this curse of people who get sudden fame, and this soon they die, and they usually die in kind of really tragic, often bizarre ways. So I really loved writing that because, first of all, there's some historical truth to that. A lot of the story about Robert Johnson himself has been verified by historians who talked to the blues players at the time. But then there's this other element that fascinates me because if you take out all the supernatural, what you really have is a story almost in the nutshell of both an artist's journey as well as kind of rock and roll. And rock and roll is in a continual process of reinvention. And if you follow rock history, you see that you have this established group of musicians who determine what's good and what's bad. And if you're not good enough, you get kicked out into the, the sides. And then those people who were kicked out of the mainstream circle seem to develop their own artistry, their own music, their own style. And suddenly, they do the deal with the devil, and suddenly they are thrust into the mainstream. The money comes in, the music, the guys in the suits, all of those supposed benefits happen. And then the next thing you know, they are overindulged. They lose their ability to write good music. Their music becomes commoditized. It becomes, bland. And then the next group comes in. So they're in that story, I see a lot more than just the supernatural. I see a really interesting piece of mythology. And to your point earlier, that's really what it's about, is that this becomes kind of a working mythology. The other kind of part of this is that there's a literal crossroads curse, in that some of the artists like Lynyrd Skynyrd, the Allman Brothers, as well as some other artists who play Robert Johnson's Crossroads. He had a song about the crossroads. When they play that, it turns out that they have tragedies in their own life. So I kind of find that by far is my favorite legend among the ones I've done.
And that brings to mind the Crossroads are rich in historical lore and tradition concerning magic and mysticism. I mean, it goes back, as you said, to African American traditions. It goes back to European traditions. Yeah, even today, it's believed that you can leave offerings to the Greek goddess Hecate at the crossroads on a new moon and achieve desired results. And it's interesting, and it's amazing to me how all these stories pass down through time, and they become adapted and part of other traditions, and they stay alive in the way that we tell our stories, and even as musicians work their music.
Absolutely.
Why do you think these kinds of stories, especially, the ghost stories and the paranormal, especially around musicians, and why do you think these continue to persist in our culture?
I think, and this is just my initial impression. I do believe that the mere fact of the conscious raising ability of music makes people more accepting of these ideas, the supernatural. I think musicians themselves have more of a heightened state of consciousness, especially when they are. I guess especially when they're in front of a crowd and that energy. I mean, all you have to do is look at an Elvis concert and then look at a church service, and you do see similar aspects, especially kind of ecstatic energy, and so I think that raises the level of consciousness of these people, that they're more accepting. The other thing is, I hate to say this because I'm going to sound like John Lennon when he said that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus, but I think a lot of organized religion has been put under a lot of scrutiny and question, whereas our devotion seems to be more directed towards these people in pop culture. So maybe that even has something to do with that. I mean, we don't usually have a lot of new prophets coming out, but we always have new musicians and new artists and new stars coming out. So maybe that's part of it too. But it's a great question, and it's something that I think a lot about when I'm writing these things. Is the the quantity and the quality of these stories to me means that there's something very important going on. And what exactly it is, I'm not sure, but I just have those guesses.
I absolutely agree. There is something really important about these stories, whether they're something that just excite the imagination or inspire other artists to create a way to build friendship and connection to other people in the way we share our stories, or as we've kind of hit on several times in the last hour, that it's this kind of modern mythology that's unique to the subculture of music, and it even grows out beyond that into, haunted houses and studios and music halls and everything else in between. Your work, it's clear that you have a passion for your work, and I commend you on that, and I thank you greatly for the time that you take to tell your stories and preserve this living history. There's not enough recognition for the people that do that kind of work in our culture, and one day I just hope that the importance of that is seen and recognized. We have kind of come to the end of the allotted time for the show, and it's been a wonderful time talking to you, Matt.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here and sharing all that you've discovered and your personal thoughts on the matters. Do you have any parting thoughts you'd like to share before we go?
I don't really have anything. I just really enjoyed talking to you about this, and I appreciate that people like you are out there who do get it and kind of help spread the word about it. And whether you pick it up in one of my books or whether you find it on your own, I just ask people to explore it. And if you have any great stories, please let me know. I'm actually trying to collect for a second round of Haunted Rock and Roll, see if I can get that published.
That's excellent. So how can people find you out there? Find you, get a hold of you with their stories, and find your work?
One way to do it is I'm on Facebook and Twitter. I think it's Matt Swayne Books on Twitter, and you can find me Matt Swayne on Facebook, and it's SWAYNE. Lonnie found me. You guys can find me. And also I have a website, mattswayne.com.
Outstanding. All right, Matt. Well, thank you again for being here. It was wonderful to hear all those stories, and I wish you a great deal of success in all your future endeavors. I'm personally looking forward to see what sort of new stories you find in the haunted tales of rock and roll.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to all my listeners and subscribers to Weird Web Radio. You can find the show at weirdwebradio.com and weirdwebradio.libsyn.com. I'm on Facebook at facebook.com/weirdwebradio and Twitter at weirdwebradio. You can subscribe by email here on weirdwebradio.com in your favorite podcast apps and in iTunes. Just search for us by name as Weird Web Radio. Please remember to rate, comment, and share the shows you like. It helps others find us in the search results. Seek the mysteries and delights in life, my friends, and as always, stay weird out there.